Have you ever heard of the Yamato? The most powerful battleship ever built? A true monster of the seas, a symbol of imperial might. But what if I told you this legendary warship was also one of the biggest, most expensive failures in military history? Let's dive into the shocking story of the Yamato, a floating fortress that turned out to be a colossal waste. Picture this. It's the late 1930s. Japan, dreaming of naval supremacy, decides to build a battleship so powerful it could single-handedly take on any enemy fleet. The result was the Yamato-class. Its crown jewels were its 9 main guns, the largest ever mounted on a warship. Each barrel was 18.1 inches in diameter, capable of hurling a shell the weight of a small car over 26 miles. The sheer scale was mind-boggling. But here's the first jaw-dropping fact. In its entire service life, these mighty cannons sank only one single American destroyer. One. All that firepower, all that engineering for one small ship. Now let's talk about the cost. Building the Yamato was an undertaking of epic proportions. The official price tag was around 137 million yen back in 1940. But what does that really mean? Well, for the same price, Japan could have built about 1,000 state-of-the-art fighter planes. And they didn't just build one Yamato, they built 2. Its sister ship, the Musashi. So, that's a choice. 2 battleships or 2,000 fighter planes. In an era where air power was becoming king, Japan chose the ships. This decision would come back to haunt them in the most devastating way possible. The problems with the Yamato weren't just about its cost or its lack of kills. The ship was so powerful it was a danger to itself. Firing a full salvo from its main guns was a cataclysmic event. The shockwave was so immense it could damage the ship's own systems. The radio equipment would get knocked out, rendering communication impossible. The delicate reconnaissance float planes stored on its deck could be shredded by the blast. Even the crew suffered. Sailors had to take cover or risk having their eardrums ruptured. Imagine a weapon so strong you're afraid to use it to its full potential. And what about that incredible 26-mile range? It sounds impressive, right? A true long-range killer? But in reality, it was mostly theoretical. First, there's the curvature of the Earth. At that distance, the target would be over the horizon, making direct line-of-sight aiming impossible. You'd need a spotter plane to guide the shells. But in a real battle, with enemy fighters swarming the skies, keeping a slow, vulnerable spotter plane alive was a fantasy. And even when they could see the target, the accuracy was abysmal. At a more typical combat range of 20,000 yards, or about 11 miles, the hit probability for each shell was a measly 0.2%. That means for every 500 shells fired, only 1 was expected to hit. It was like trying to hit a fly with a cannonball from miles away. But the Yamato's biggest weakness, the one that ultimately sealed its fate, was its insatiable thirst for fuel. This ship was a glutton. Just cruising at a moderate speed, it would burn through 300 to 600 tons of fuel oil every single day. For a country like Japan, which had very limited oil reserves and relied heavily on imports, this was a logistical nightmare. By 1944, the American submarine blockade had choked off Japan's oil supply. The once mighty Yamato, the pride of the fleet, was reduced to a sitting duck tied up in port because there simply wasn't enough fuel to move it. It was a giant, useless steel statue. Let's look at its service record. The Yamato was commissioned in December 1941 and was sunk in April 1945. That has a service life of about 1,200 days. Out of all that time, guess how many days it spent in actual combat, firing its guns in anger? Just 10 days. 10. That's less than 1% of its entire career. For the other 99% of the time, it was either sailing between bases, undergoing refits, or just sitting in harbor, burning fuel and resources. It was more of a floating hotel for admirals than a feared weapon of war. When it did finally see significant action, another critical flaw was exposed: its shockingly poor anti-aircraft defense. For a ship built to dominate the seas, its designers seemed to forget that the biggest threat would come from the sky. Initially, it had very few anti-aircraft guns. And even after numerous upgrades that saw its decks bristling with hundreds of cannons and machine guns, it was too little, too late. The sheer volume of fire looked impressive, but it was largely ineffective against fast-moving, high-altitude bombers and nimble torpedo planes. This weakness was laid bare during its final tragic mission. That mission was Operation Tengo. By April 1945, the war was lost for Japan. American forces were landing on Okinawa, the doorstep to the Japanese mainland. In a desperate final act of defiance, the Imperial High Command ordered the Yamato to sortie its mission, to beach itself on Okinawa, and act as an unsinkable gun battery, fighting until it was destroyed. It was given only enough fuel for a one-way trip. This wasn't a military operation. It was a nationally televised suicide. It was pure propaganda, a way to show the world that the Japanese spirit was not broken. The lives of the crew were an afterthought. On its way, the Yamato and its small escort were spotted. The U.S. Navy unleashed hell. Nearly 400 aircraft from 11 different carriers swarmed the lone battleship. Despite its upgraded defenses, the Yamato was overwhelmed. It was hit by at least 11 torpedoes and 6 bombs before it finally capsized and exploded in a catastrophic fireball, taking 3,555 men down with it. Let's do one last cost comparison to really drive the point home. The cost of the 2 Yamato-class battleships could have paid for 6 modern fleet aircraft carriers. 6. An aircraft carrier wasn't just one ship. It was a mobile airbase that could launch hundreds of planes. 6 carriers could have projected a combined force of over 1,000 aircraft across the Pacific. Instead, Japan got 2 battleships, and the irony is poetic. The Yamato, a ship designed to sink other battleships, was ultimately sunk by airplanes, launched from aircraft carriers, 11 of them. The final insult, a single Mark 13 torpedo, the kind that crippled and sank the Yamato, cost about $1,000 at the time. A single 18-inch shell for the Yamato's main guns cost the modern equivalent of $50,000. The Americans spent a few $1,000s on cheap torpedoes to sink a multi-billion-dollar warship. The math just doesn't lie. The Yamato was a magnificent piece of engineering, a true marvel of its time. But it was a dinosaur, born in an age that had already passed it by. It represented a failed doctrine, the belief that a single, powerful ship could decide the fate of a war. In the end, the story of the Yamato isn't one of glory, but a tragic lesson in inefficiency, waste, and the stubborn refusal to adapt to a new reality. It was the ultimate weapon for a war that was no longer being fought. Thanks so much for watching. If you found this story as fascinating as I did, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into history. Let me know in the comments what other historical blunders you'd like to see covered. See you next time.